report card for the Gulf of Mexico. So from just his presentation there at the New Orleans meetings and seeing some of the work that they've done elsewhere, I saw a lot of applicability to a lot of the things that we do, you know, as we try to track the things that are going on in our watersheds, report back to stakeholders, show them, you know, the status of the water quality within our watersheds. I just felt it had great utility for us and for tracking our watershed plans and other efforts. So with that introduction, we'll give this a try and hopefully we'll be able to hear Bill. I apologize, Bill, for you having to endure a night in Houston with being stuck in the airport with the rainstorm, but I'm glad to have you on the phone with us.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. I am sorry that I'm not there in person. This provides a little unplanned experiment in remote delivery using this technology. We're using GoToMeeting, which is something I've found very effective, and I see on your agenda you're interested in these kinds of interactive approaches, so maybe this will be a little added bonus for your meeting. I also apologize to anybody I kept awake last night between 10 and midnight when we circled Waco endlessly looking for an opportunity to land, so I hope I didn't keep anybody awake. I have been told that I have a face for radio, so perhaps I'm giving you guys a little break from not having to look at me. And I regret that I have about 20 pounds of handouts that I was going to deluge you with, and I'm going to have to lug back home with me, but I will mail them down your way and let you distribute them accordingly. So today I was going to try to convince you that watershed report cards can catalyze positive environmental outcomes. And this is why I'm excited that you're interested in this topic. I think it's proven to me to be a valuable tool in environmental management. So the four things I'll go through today are that environmental report cards can lead to outcomes. They're a great way of synthesizing data. I want to give you some real-world examples where report cards can benefit management, they can benefit research, and they can provide positive feedback for monitoring. And then I'll talk about a simple 5-step process of generating report cards. And then I'd like to end with something applicable to your roundtable is the role of watershed organizations in environmental reporting. And we have a group in the Chesapeake region we're calling IMTAC, the Mid-Atlantic Tributary Assessment Coalition, and I will describe our sort of evolution of that with the idea that perhaps that will resonate with what you're doing with your in your roundtable here. So let me just tell you where I'm coming from. This is a group of scientists, science communicators, and science integrators formed into this Integration and Application Network. It's part of the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. And what happened about 2000 was the faculty got together and came to the conclusion that they've been studying Chesapeake Bay for 75 years, since 1925, when the first Chesapeake Biological Laboratory was created, and essentially documenting the decline, not doing anything to try to really help improve the status of Chesapeake Bay. So they looked around and they found there's a book by Boyer called Scholarship Reconsidered, and instead of having academia be focused on research, teaching, and service, it redefined it as discovery, integration, application, and teaching. So the integration and application components are what stimulated this concept that we needed to create an entity that just focuses on integrating science and applying it, and the scholarship of that, doing it well, and sharing that knowledge with others. So that's what's behind this creation of this integration application network. And just for a location map, we're located on Chesapeake Bay. Chesapeake is in a very large, extensive estuary, 200 miles from top to bottom, full range salinity at the mouth and fresh water at the top and up in the tributaries. We have a few big cities in the watershed, about 17 million people total, and as you see, one of the important big cities in the watershed is Washington, D.C., so we got a lot of national attention. Our local newspaper, the Washington Post, gets read by Congress and such. So when things don't go well for Chesapeake Bay, they become quite contentious and politicized, and so this is sort of a bit of a national stage for some of the things we're doing there. So one of the things that's occurred in the last 10 to 20 years is what I call an observation revolution. We've got a data gathering capacity that's unprecedented in the history of the world. We've got more sensors, more platforms for those sensors, either in the sky or on the ground, that stream increasingly dense amounts of data. So in Chesapeake, for example, we estimated several years ago that we collect about 10 million data points per year. So, I mean, some of those are, not high quality data, but nonetheless, incredible data gathering capacity that we have increasing. Now, we have analysis tools for handling that data. We have databases, we have GIS, we have models, we have ways to statistics to analyze that data. But it's really getting into the synthesis of that data that leads to outcomes in an adaptive management context that really becomes important. So what we're trying to do with environmental report cards is to take that flood of data, and it can be a flood. It can be like trying to get a drink out of a fire hose. If you just increase the data pressure through that fire hose, you don't necessarily get more water to drink. So we need to think very carefully about how to synthesize that and how to lead to outcomes. So I'll give you these examples using the report cards of doing that. But the other thing I want to point out is that the report cards really are a tool within a broader environmental campaign. So this book that I was going to pass around is available on the web, and what we do in this is we talk about the ways of obtaining environmental data, various ways and lessons learned about analyzing environmental data, and then report cards are a way of building community knowledge, and then using that to engage the community in an overall campaign to actually achieve improvements in water quality or whatever the goals may be. So we've got this triangle or pyramid of management, research, and monitoring. You'll see that as a common theme throughout. And very importantly, the arrows that connect them that involve communication, the effective communication between research and management, management and monitoring and research. So let me do one definition, and that's the definition of ecosystem health and what integrated assessment of that would be. And so I use this cutesy little acronym that to do this ecosystem health well, it should be hypothesis driven. So hypothesis that nutrient reductions are going to lead to less hypoxia. Chesapeake Bay is our major driving hypothesis. It's driving our TMDL process and our regulations. We need to be explicit spatially and temporally, and I think it's really important that we be able to map these features and track them through time. We need to have integrated assessment that's adaptable to changing management needs and research findings. So if sea level is an emerging problem, then we need to think about ways of monitoring the effects and impacts of sea level rise, even though 20 years ago that might not have been an issue. We need to be linked to a communication program. This isn't any good to be doing and keeping it a secret. So, and we'll talk about that in some of these examples, but communication is absolutely key. Need to have timely outputs. The data stream that goes into information and knowledge needs to be streamlined so that we're getting timely feedback, so that the managers who are making decision makers who are using this data to inform them have the data in a timely fashion. And it needs to be highly visible to the stakeholders. This is part of the communication strategy, but also, as it turns out, we've learned report cards have to be delivered in person to the senior decision makers before they see it in the news. If it hits the news and they don't know anything about it, you tend to get in trouble. They can handle bad news, but they need prior warning. So you need to have a technique of bringing this to the stakeholders early in the game. So those are some basics about ecosystem health. Now, report cards are kind of the flavor of the month, and they really are increasingly popular. One of the reasons is that this statting is being used by government. Statting is a term that originated in New York City with the formation of a police department. Came up with they call it computer statistics, or ComStat, and they've spread. Houston has it. Most major North American and European cities use a form of statting, which is mapping and tracking where crime occurs and deploying the police resources accordingly. This has been expanded to managing city governments. CityStat, created in Baltimore by Martin O'Malley, now the governor of Maryland, and has gone on to create StateStat, BayStat, PhillyStat, CapStat in DC. There are a bunch of places that are using this decision-making using data. Secondly, diffuse pollution is much more complex than point source pollution. Point source pollution, you just need the sewage engineers to give you the data about the flow, and you can track that quite easily. Diffuse pollution is much more complex, and you need to synthesize a suite of measurements to look at the impacts of air or water quality degradation. And then thirdly, data gathering capacity, as I mentioned, is increasing, and there's a need to use that data and interpret it and find ways to integrate that data. Report cards provide a mechanism of taking large data sets and synthesizing them and then effectively communicating them. So one of the things I've found is that these environmental report cards are really powerful tools. They really work. They really garner public attention. They really can catalyze change. I'll go through the examples and show you some of those examples. But before I do that, let me reflect on why they work. And this is sort of after the fact that I went through this exercise of trying to understand, well, why do these things work? Why do they resonate so well? We started doing them in Australia, and we've applied them in North America, and everywhere we've gone, they've been really effective. Well, I'm thinking that one of the major reasons they work is because of peer pressure. It's such a powerful human motivator. The peer pressure that I'm referring to is the mayor of a local council or municipality, and they look at where they are and what their report card score is, and they don't really care whether it's an A, B, C, D, or F, but they do care that they're better than the guy next to them. They just want to be better than the other guy. And so they want bragging rights if they're better, or they want to catch up if they're behind. And so I think that that's really been effective. I started realizing that when we started doing our report cards in Australia back in 2000 in Queensland, and I would be getting telephone calls from the Lord Mayor of Brisbane or the Caboolture Shire Mayor, and about 2 weeks before the report cards were being released, and they'd say, "Hey Bill, how'd I do?" and say, well, you got a B-. And they're like, well, is there anything I can do for extra credit? Any way I can prove that? I had to convince them that no, in 2 weeks you can't change your grade, but we did learn to help them tell their story of sometimes their upgrades that they were put online weren't enacted yet, and there's a lag time and all that. But basically, it was clear to me that the peer pressure was a motivator, because they always would ask, well, how did so-and-so do, by the way? So the other thing I think that's good about report cards is that we've trained people. Everybody's taken, pretty much everybody has had 12 years of getting report cards, at least. And some of us overeducated people have gotten them for even longer. So report cards we've been doing for a long time. And in fact, the Chesapeake report card that we do annually, we delivered in the same envelope that the school kids get their report cards in. So I'll tell you, your heart skips a beat when you get that envelope and you're about to open it up and how did I do it? And so there's that reveal that comes out of opening the envelope. If I were there in person, I'd be showing you this envelope and revealing. Then, of course, the synthesis of large amounts of data make them resonate, that people understand and appreciate that they are founded on data, that this isn't a qualitative exercise, that this has quantitative scientific support. So anyway, let me tell you these examples, and I'll do this in the context of this management, research, and monitoring triangle that I showed earlier. So I've got, this is a philosophical slide, basically, is that I'm convinced you can create an environmental campaign by having a shared vision with the stakeholders, by organizing their participation so that the managers are using science-based decision-making. They're not making knee-jerk decisions uninformed. The research is being applied and directed towards that shared vision. This isn't the research, the esoteric research that some of my scientific colleagues do, but it's the applied research. And the monitoring it's not about just counting the crabs or the seagrasses or the oxygen levels. It's about monitoring and providing feedback to the management actions. By doing that and having leadership in government and research and monitoring and feeding us out to the various scientific communities, NGOs, and governments, then engaging the entire community to focus their actions so that they're effective and can be directed towards achieving the shared vision, you really can solve environmental problems, even the most difficult and complex problems. So, with this kind of cloverleaf approach, what I'll do is now go through examples of where report cards can help create that management initiatives that help the research and help the monitoring. And I'll go through it in starting with the management ones. So we'll start by talking about some examples of where management is enhanced using environmental report cards. I'll start by the one that I first began report cards in Southeast Queensland in around 2000. And what you see here is the report card in the upper left, and then the middle photograph there are a few of us standing beside this bulldozer, and the guy sitting in the bulldozer is the mayor of Redcliffe at the time. And this little community made the largest single expenditure in the history of that community to upgrade their sewage. And it was in an election year, and the mayor told me afterwards, we don't normally get elected based on sewage upgrades. We get elected with parks and roads and visible things, bridges. But we thought it was important because we saw that our grade wasn't good and we had our own set of problems. We couldn't blame the adjacent larger city. So they made a huge commitment, and they were able to, by kicking this off, catalyze a whole lot of other upgrades. In fact, within several years, they've gone completely to from what was BNR, biological ecological and nutrient removal, which is, like 8 milligram per liter nitrogen, for example, to enhanced nutrient removal, ENR, which is 3 milligrams per liter. So they really stepped it up. We're still in Chesapeake trying to get to the ENR levels. The other thing that's actually happened is that we've actually got these people are set up now for zero discharge. They've got pipes to recycle the wastewater back into the dam using reverse osmosis. They haven't had to use it yet because they've been deluged with floods, but next drought they will. And so they've really had a social change, a real sea change. And it literally was an urban joke when I was there that, what are we going to do with this wastewater? Well, we could, ha ha ha, pipe it back in the reservoir and drink it. Laughter. Well, now they're actually doing it. So 10 years later, that urban joke became a reality. So that's a fantastic story, and you can see that the wastewater discharges reduce the sewage nutrients that we mapped using a stable isotope tracer, and it's been a fantastic success story, the Healthy Waterways campaign. Second example of effective guiding management is one we're using in Maryland, and this is this Baystat thing I alluded to earlier. And this is where we monthly meet with the governor and all his chief environmental advisors, legal advisors to come up with strategies to accelerate the restoration of Chesapeake Bay. And so he's allocated about $25 million a year towards, we got about $40 million a year to upgrade sewage treatment using a novel funding scheme, flush fee they call it. And now we also have $25 million a year for diffuse sources. So the allocation of where we spend those diffuse sources uses the report card as a way to prioritize the tributaries and the different nutrient sources. So in this case, the report card isn't just tracking how we're doing, but also prioritizing where we spend our big dollars on environmental restoration. So that's been really an effective approach. And then a third and final example for management is an example where the U.S. State Department approached us after seeing what was going on in Chesapeake Bay. Remember, this is Washington Post territory. So they're having problems out in the Caucasus, where 3 countries that share this Kura River, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and the Republic of Georgia, wouldn't talk, wouldn't even get in the same room together. So they thought that the one central uniting theme that they had was maintaining clean water through this Kura River. So they were able to convene. That photo in the top right is the most important part of this thing, is that we actually got Armenians and Azerbaijanis and Georgians in the same room to come up with this report card, because that's the thing that they could share. And the whole idea behind the State Department was, well, if we can do it through build trust and show people can work together, maybe that can help in other affairs of state rather than just environmental. So it was a really interesting exercise. We worked with them and they had all kinds of issues. They still use DDT. They have open pit copper mines and zinc mines, and so we went through, and the water flows over into the Caspian Sea, and the dolphins are full of heavy metals. So we went through this process and translated it into Russian as well, and it was really unfortunately, it's about the time we were getting ready for phase 2, the Russians invaded Georgia, and they closed down the Tbilisi operation for a while. So we haven't seen any longer-term effects on that yet, but it'd be interesting to see if that'll have a lasting impact. Okay, and if we can do it there, then let's not worry about Mexico versus U.S. or Virginia versus Maryland, or, you know, if they can do it when they're actively at war with one another, then we should be able to do it other places. Now, another example that I wanted to add to this that I didn't originally have is one that we recently just released, and this is in Australia in the Great Barrier Reef, which is about 1,500 miles long, stretching from the tip of the North Cape York, the tip of Australia, down to the southeast. And you can see three categories of results: land practice results, catchment results, and marine results. So the marine results are the typical report card, which includes, in the case of the Great Barrier Reef, coral, seagrass, and water quality. And the loads are very similar to the kinds of things that we worry about: nitrogen, phosphorus, pesticides, and sediments. And then the land practice. Now here's the novelty, here's the interesting bit that this reporting has been able to include. We haven't been able to do that in Chesapeake yet. But what we did there is we worked with sugarcane growers and graziers, the cattle ranchers, and horticulture, the bananas and pineapple communities. And we got the farmers to self-identify what was an acceptable practice, what was best practice, what was acceptable practice, what was unacceptable practice, and started evaluating that. Now, there was an inducement. The federal and state governments of Australia put up $400 million to the farmers to improve their practices. So we were able to, you know, convince them that self-reporting was a really good thing. And so the innovation, I went up a couple times to the cane farmers to work with them on reporting their innovative, it's unleashing the innovative creativity of these farmers is astounding. So it's really exciting that you're really starting to, by having this reporting, you're starting to see some real on-the-ground action, and the farmers were being more creative than any government regulation could ever come up with. So that's pretty exciting. So watch that space for the Great Barrier Reef report card. It's really going to be an interesting experiment. So I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about research advantages, opportunities created by report cards. This isn't going to be as important to your roundtable group, but I do want to cover this briefly to say that you can get new insights that you wouldn't have otherwise. And I'll share a Chesapeake one a little later, but for right now, let me do the Great Barrier Reef example. And you can see we have 6 watersheds on the left map there. And the brown one in the middle, the Burdekin, turned out to be way worse than the other ones. If you look on the green to red assessment there, the Burdekin came out really badly. And so we were saying, well, why? I didn't wonder why. And then we looked at a previously published book, and we recognized the Burdekin had a huge discharge, huge sediment export rates, nitrogen, phosphorus, and the highest disturbance in the basin, mostly grazing, mostly cattle. So it was kind of a duh moment. You know, we kind of like, we should have figured this out before, but the reef is huge. It was like blind men with an elephant couldn't see the pattern, couldn't see the forest for the trees until we had the report card, and then it all made sense. So these insights are important for scientists as well. Next example is, and I alluded to the sewage plume maps earlier. Well, the way we did the sewage plume maps is we had a series of honors and PhD students that studied this isotopic signal, the signature that you could collect by putting these macroalgae out in the bay with these cheap little buoy and bricks. So we lose maybe 5 or 10% of these to the fishermen or recreational folks, but we could absorb the loss, and we would deploy these in the lighted part of the water column, and then let them soak up the nutrients, and that signal that we could see from the sewage nutrients, the N15, was easily detected and distinguished from the ambient background, and it was able to generate these maps of sewage plumes. And then there's some great spatial statistics we were able to generate from this. So basically we were able to use this applied research to generate research papers and master's and PhD theses. Another important part of this is scaling. So what I was involved with a few years ago was a national assessment of estuarine health using this with NOAA, the National Oceanographic Atmospheric Administration, and we wrote a book and have this map, and I'll never want to do this again. I don't think they're very useful at that scale. But when you drill into the Chesapeake, it did become quite relevant, and even more so, and this is where we're going to get into the smaller scale county group report cards, where you really are talking about people's backyards and sub-watershed levels that can really have positive feedback. So one of the good questions you have in science is this question of scaling, and so this is allowing this comparisons of time and space becomes quite useful. Examples of how this can help in a monitoring context are the following. First of all, monitoring is very expensive, and it only gets more expensive with time. Really, even with the increased sensors, people, cars and boats, it involves fuel, it involves labor, it involves things that are subject to inflationary cost increases, and it's hard to keep funding at level budgets or shrinking budgets. So the important thing about report cards is they justify the continued monitoring if they're providing timely and relevant feedback to management. And I've been through the process in Australia and the Chesapeake Bay, where it's very, very important to have a report card to be able to convince people that monitoring is going to be relevant. One of the other things it does is it accelerates the data analysis. You have a deadline. People work to deadlines. And we had a situation when I came back to Chesapeake in early 2003, is that 2002 is a very dry year. And the monitoring of the seagrasses that year was released in September of 2003, nearly a year later. Well, in 2003, the terrible year with a hurricane, and it says decreased by 38%. But meanwhile, the press release that was released in September stated that seagrasses increased by 15%. So, while technically correct, in 2002 the seagrasses increased by 50%. By releasing that to the public in September of the following year, when the seagrasses were down 38%, meant that you were off by about 50%. So, we now have that seagrass data streaming into the program by February instead of by September, so that it can be incorporated into the spring report card. So it really can help focus the science and the data acquisition and information generation. Finally, you can stimulate research that provides explanations for various monitoring trends. This is an example in the coastal bays of, this is the Laguna Madre of Maryland. It's called Chesapeake Bay. And what you see in this lagoon system is a big blob of nitrate, the big orange blob in the upper left graph, in the middle of the bay. But on either end, near the inlets, what we see using that technique of N15 tracers, sewage nutrient influences. As it turns out, the top one's explainable based on a known sewage discharge in the Ocean City region. The bottom one was inexplicable at first. It turns out Chesapeake Island is a big barrier sand island that's completely on septic, and so those septic systems are going straight into the bay. And we're now trying to convince them to put in a sewage treatment plant. So anyway, it led to a bunch of followed research to follow up on those trends. So I hope I've exhaustively convinced you that report cards can have really powerful benefits and can be really important. So let's go through the quick 5-step program of what it takes to do a report card. And I don't think they're that hard. I think a lot of people get afraid and that it's too complicated, and I don't think it's that complicated. I think what you need is a good conceptual framework. Choose a bunch of indicators, and I'll talk about how many. Define the thresholds for those indicators, your goals, if you will. Calculate your scorecard, and then communicate the results. So I'll go through these one by one. So first of all, the conceptual framework. This is the one we used in that Southeast Queensland, Australia example. We had 6 indicators: turbidity, seagrass, sewage, nitrogen plumes, water column nutrient concentrations, phytoplankton, chlorophyll A, and then a harmful algal bloom. So those are the 6 things we measured. We measured them because they're relevant to the both diffuse point sources and soil disturbance for the harmful algal bloom. We also included some of the iconic megafauna, the dugongs and turtles and seagrasses out there that people cared about. And we used this conceptual framework and we showed this to everybody repeatedly and told them why we're measuring what we're doing, and we did it in this graphical form so that a common person could understand it. Second, choosing indicators. And these are indicators that convey meaningful ecological information and can be measured reliably and repeatedly. And we went through this exercise with Rock Creek Park, a national park in the Washington, D.C. area, working with the National Park Service. We had 22 indicators, and we randomly selected out of that 22 between 2 and 21 of those indicators, and then calculated the score and then the error associated with that score. And what you see here is just the error plotted. So the variability of a report card score, if you had less than 6 metrics, became pretty excessive. But notice, once you get to 6 or more, you really reduce that variability appreciably, and that very much diminished returns as you increase the number of indicators. So, and this is sort of, as I showed you on the Australian example, we had come up with 6 indicators. Chesapeake Independent, we had come up with 6 indicators. You know, I basically say you want to be able to count the number of indicators on your hand, on your fingers. You don't want to have to take your shoes off. You know, you just being able to do it with your fingers. And they're just indicators, and they're not everything that you'd want to know about the ecosystem. It's not a research project. It's not a complete diagnostic tool. The analogy I'll draw here is the analogy of driving a car. And what you want is a few things on your dashboard, 6 or so things that you can look at, glance at, keeping your eye on the road, keeping moving forward as you want to do in a restoration effort. And yet, occasionally you want to bring the car into the garage, hook up the computer, and diagnose what's going on. They're both important to keeping the car on the road, but these indicators, these report card indicators, are the dashboard. The quick glance, how are we doing? Third, defining thresholds. There are a couple different ways of doing it. It can be pass-fail, a binary threshold, or you can have, and we're probably in your case, and what we're evolving toward with relatively smaller data sets, that you need multiple thresholds. And so the example here of dissolved oxygen of 5.8, well, in a binary threshold you pass, but it doesn't tell you how well you passed. Well, you're pretty close to the threshold in this case. But a linear multiple threshold allows you to get a better idea where you are on that spectrum, how far away from the goal you are. So defining thresholds, and they don't have to be all ecological based. It can be management thresholds. In the case of oxygen, it's related to what fish need to survive, but it can be seagrass area that you want to achieve. It can be historic or geographic reference points. Then calculating a scorecard. There are lots of different ways of doing that. In the case of Chesapeake Bay, what we did is pull the the results of 3 water quality indicators, dissolved oxygen, water clarity, and chlorophyll, and created a water quality index. And then we put together 3 biotic indicators, which were seagrasses and the bay index of biotic integrity of the clams and the worms and the benthic community, and then the phytoplankton community as well. And then combined both of those into the report card, and then we gave it assigned, based on this numerical scale you see, assigned a letter grade and used a stoplight color scheme to communicate that. And it was pretty interesting when we did that. Finally, communicating the results. And so these report cards, because people quickly grasp what an A and an F reflect, they do garner public attention, and so we've learned to effectively do a press conference each time we release a new report card, and use that opportunity to have a public dialogue of what's happened and needs to improve. Let me give you an example now that we've explained, how we generate the report card of how you can kind of build on this. So this is our Chesapeake report card on the left. You saw that earlier. And what you see here are some areas that are pretty good and some areas that are pretty bad. Well, first thing we learned is unexpectedly that some of the good areas were actually not near the mouth at the bottom of the estuary with the oceanic exchange, but in fact up at the top. And then some areas were in the middle there were particularly bad. And then we, because in Chesapeake we had the advantage of 25 years of continuous data collection, and we chose indicators that had been around for that long, we were able to back calculate scores and provide with an interactive tool on our website, which you can go and have a play with. We were able to provide these trajectories, and we were able to determine that out of the 15 reporting regions, 3 had improving trajectories, 3 had degrading trajectories. And we started to think, why was that? And we started getting into this concept of positive and negative feedbacks, and that's really important for management. So if you can get these things going on a positive feedback, and we think we've done that successfully in the Upper Bay, resurgence of seagrasses has allowed them to be resilient to floods, has allowed them to clarify the water. The fish are back, the crabs are back. The water clarity is unprecedented. So these things are good and getting better and building towards a better future. The negative, when we reduce oxygen in the organic loading is high enough that we reduce the oxygen to the bottom waters, then the nutrients come squirting back out and create a runaway algal bloom situation, and that's unfortunately the degradation trend that we see here. So these tipping points can be really informative in how to do good management. We also developed watershed stream health indicators using benthic macroinvertebrates, the bugs, the caddisflies and such that live in the streams. We mapped that, and we started to look at the Little Red area and the Patapsco River area, which is where the lowest water quality of the Tributary Bay report card on the right. And we started correlating. I realized that in fact, using independent means, using bugs in the streams versus the 6 water quality biotic indicators for the bay, we have a strong correlation, and that's the first time we were able to demonstrate that with monitoring rather than modeling data. So that gives us in the bay an opportunity to sort of decentralize this. Instead of talking about the bay, capital T-H-E, bay, that nobody really had ownership of, to the Choptank River, to the Potomac River, the Patuxent River, where people could identify with. We realized we were on the right track, that this provided that peer pressure, provided that opportunity for communities to get involved in improving their river. When the Choptank got a D and was the second worst in the first year we released the report card, next to the Patapsco River where Baltimore City sits, those 3 counties over there got very upset and excited and have initiated. They've all hired river keepers. They've all worked together now to try to improve it's mostly rural agricultural runoff. So it really stimulated a good activity. So what we started to do, and this is the final bit of this talk, and I want to bring it back to what you guys are up to, is this Mid-Atlantic Tributary Coalition formation. And this is a group of river keeper / water keeper groups that got together and started talking about doing these regional report cards. And this group has been growing with time. So and they use citizen scientists for collecting these regional data sets. And the Chester River, one of the first ones, they had 80 to 100 Chester testers each year that go out on boats and down into docks or driving to roadway culverts, sampling water quality. And it turned out the Patuxent River was doing something similar. The Severn River was doing using high school kids and a retired NIH scientist, and so different groups were doing different ways, but we got them to agree on a protocol, and we basically came up with a concept. We're going to all measure 6 things the same way, and then we'll have electives. So we have core curriculum and electives. So we wrote a little manual about how we do that, how we calculate it, what thresholds to use, and we thrashed it through, and we spent a year and a half doing that. We published this little booklet on how to do that. So now we can intercompare from the Chester River to the Severn River to the Patuxent River. And we've got about a dozen of these now happening in the Chesapeake region. Each year we add to, and we ask one of the more experienced groups to kind of mentor the newer group coming in and help them in their production. And we train them, and they produce those little report card newsletters you see up here. Those are produced in-house by the river keeper, water keeper group. You know, that we give them the training to do that, and so they learn by a little desktop publishing software, and they generate these things. We help them do the initial analysis and set them up the first time, but then they're pretty much off on their own. So they generate this. It's a great public outreach. Their membership's increased, their funding's increased. They're seeing really positive outcomes from this. One of the things that we're interested in doing, building a report card app for smartphones for citizen scientists. We have a proposal in the EPA right now, and this is from that proposal, but just want to throw that out. But this is a great way to engage people with smartphones now. You can take photographs, you can look at watercolor, you can gauge the flow rates, you can go to the various best management practices and document those. So there are lots of things that you could do to upload, download data to engage the citizen scientist. And frankly, the government ain't going to give us any more money than we're getting. The federal government and state government, they're pretty tapped out. The only way we're going to get increased monitoring is by engaging volunteers. But volunteers that are trained, volunteers that have the tools, citizen scientists can really be a game changer. And I think this is the future for where we need to go. So the framework that we've got for the Gulf of Mexico is to be measuring a variety of in this driver, pressure, stressor, state, impacts, response framework, which scientists love to do to make themselves look smart. I'll just focus in on these state of environment, synthesis environmental indicators, and we can do that both at that broad scope of all the Gulf of Mexico, but then in the regional estuaries and lagoons, then there's an opportunity to develop regional report cards that fit into this framework. One of the things that we need to identify, we call it the wedding cake, is that there are different audiences, and so you do the state of the environment reporting for the elected officials, the top of the wedding cake, make it very graphic, very easy to understand. But then you have as a foundation a much more detailed, rigorous assessment. Our little Chesapeake report card's a little trifold, really short, but it's underlined with 240 web pages that are unique each year to the data that we've accumulated. So you can you have a solid foundation and have different audiences, but ultimately, the aggregation and the communication should be central in the top layer. And I will say that this report card stuff is all these examples we've been doing since 2000. It's been around for a long time. Doing a good report card is something that's steeped in historically. So I just love this map. It's called the Ghost Map. It was produced by John Snow, a physician in London, and each dot on that map is a death by cholera during an outbreak in 1854. And then the little red dots are the pump stations where those where people collected their drinking water. And you see that there's right in the middle of that map, there's a pump, the Broad Street pump, that was contaminated, causing the cholera deaths. And so Snow did this map, the ghost map, and was able to convince the city elders to remove the pump handle and quell the cholera epidemic. So, you know, good environmental reporting can save lives. Good environmental reporting's been around for a long time. This is pre-GIS, but now we have fancier tools and better data acquisition. We can use this to be effective. So, to conclude, environmental report cards can lead to outcomes. They can benefit management, research, and monitoring. There's a simple 5-step process in your report cards, and they can be a really powerful tool for watershed organizations such as the ones we're associated with. And I will post, because of this complicated technology thing, I'll post this talk onto the Ian website, and so you can have a look at it at your leisure. I've also sent through a copy to Courtney Smith if she wants to share it there. You're welcome to it. So I'll end here and be available for questions for the and maybe Courtney can either relay them to me or type them in. Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions? Hold on just a second.
How often, and it's probably case specific, but how often would you recommend releasing these report cards? Did you hear that?
Yeah, I did. That's a good question. I actually have a slide up here I want to show that can maybe touch on that. I call report cards an annual event because, again, that's the metaphor we're using for report cards is something that we're used to getting on pretty much a regular semester or annual basis. I think there's also an opportunity to do something we would call integrated assessments, a multi-year assessment, which is more strategic and probably focuses more on management priorities and data gaps and recommendations, and can include more indicators and sort of a different audience. But for the report cards, I think it really provides an opportunity for an annual dialogue, at least an annual dialogue with the community. And I think with environmental issues, if you don't get in front of people every year, you lose momentum. I think you need to think about annual. And it does affect the choice of indicators. You want things that respond on those timescales. If you're looking at something like percent impervious area, you know, the roads and the roofs, that doesn't change very quickly, so that probably wouldn't be an indicator you'd want to use in an annual report card, but maybe something you'd assess at a 5 or decadal 10-year time period. Some people are considering biannual, some people, but the ones we usually get involved in, we try to generate an annual report card.
Anybody else? Well, thank you very much for doing this. I'm glad it worked out. Did you?
Well, I'm glad you guys have tolerated this technology delivery.
I want to know if he's got a crowd around him at the airport now watching this presentation.
They want to know if everyone's watching you. You're in a private room, right?
Yeah, I went and got a room because I thought that it was really the loudspeakers that were killing me outside in the lobby. So I decided you guys didn't want to hear about the delay, the canceled flight to Waco that you would appreciate just hearing me. But yeah, it's not a bad. Houston Airport's not as bad as it sounds.
Thanks a lot, Bill.